I have the honor to introduce the next speaker, and we're going to change gears a bit. Of course, if you want to realize the energy transition and meet the Paris Climate Agreement, you need a broad approach, considering not only technological changes, but also socio-economic aspects, policies, etc. This is why I'm very proud to introduce Bob van der Zwaan today, who may be most familiar to most of you, who integrates in a very broad approach, let's say, not only technological innovation, but also social sciences, international affairs and policy. So Bob is professor at the University of Amsterdam. He is senior science leader at the Energy Transition Unit at TNO, and also adjunct professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University, the School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna. His research really combines in a uniquely integrated way different aspects of the energy transition. Bob has many guest professorships in various countries. He is lead author of the Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and his research again spans fields of energy and climate change, integrated assessment, modeling, environmental economics, and technological innovation. Very happy you join us today, Bob. And once you're ready, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for this very extensive, detailed introduction. And thanks a lot for the organizers. Doesn't work? Now it works, yes, sorry. So thanks a lot for this introduction, and many thanks for the organizers for having me here. It's great that this time it worked out to be present and give an overview of the type of work that we do. Now, I don't do at all the type of research that you are involved in photovoltaics, but I still feel a little bit home here because I was trained as a physicist, a particle physicist actually. So I do feel a little bit of connection to this building and the work that you do. My role here to talk a little bit about the perspective of solar energy that all of you are working in relation to energy and climate change scenarios, which is the kind of thing that we do. We've got all sorts of models by which we can assess the energy system at large. And that's basically one part of the work that we do, both at TNO and here across the road at Faculty of Science of the University of Amsterdam. But we also occasionally make deep dives into individual technologies, and for us that can be really any kind of technology, solar energy, but also wind or geothermal, including also CCS and even nuclear power. Now, the first time that I did a deep dive into solar energy was exactly 20 years ago, when we were interested in learning curves for photovoltaics, and at that point in time, since then photovoltaics was still much more expensive than now, we calculated how much investments were needed in order to reach competitive break-even at that point that we are so close at now. Typically you got figures of $50 billion or so 2 decades ago. And we also tried to figure out how much of those additional investments you could justify on the basis of avoiding the damage costs of fossil fuels, just while surfing down the learning curve of photovoltaics. Now, of course, we're in a completely different environment now, but it's nice to look back at that work together with the late Ari Ravel from the École in Paris. So let me start with this graph, with which I start many different talks, and actually I'm not the only one because Anna showed a very similar graph. But I will start off with saying a couple of less optimistic things about it, because the challenges associated with this graph are really enormous. It's generated by the IPCC 4 years ago now, and it shows what we need to do in order to abide by the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is to try to aim at only 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase on our planet. Now, today we are emitting about 40 gigatons of CO2 per year, every year. And it's still, that was shown in the stylistic graph by Anna as well, it's still inclining a little bit, despite the tremendous amount of policies that across the world we have been implementing already. Now, in order to not exceed this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, we need to get to net zero emissions of CO2 by the middle of the century. And for that, as the graph shows, we need extremely rapid declines of these emissions. And that means not just, by the way, changing completely the energy system, but also many other activities that we depend on, for example, land use and agriculture. Now, this graph also shows that it doesn't really matter too much for this 250 goal whether we always stay on track of 1.5 degrees Celsius or we temporarily exceed it a little bit to something close to 2 degrees Celsius and then revert down to 1.5 again. In both cases, that's the difference between this bluish color and the gray color. In both cases, we need to reach net zero by the middle of the century. Now, that's of course something that we all almost daily read about, all our climate goals, nationally, in Europe, globally, are focusing on. That's nothing new. What we hardly hear anything about is actually what we need to do in the second half of the century. That's the right part of this graph, which is going negative in emissions of CO2, and actually pretty deeply negative, because as negative as roughly half of the positive figures that we currently face. And we need to also to prepare already now for that part of the story. And I will talk a little bit about that as well. That was the negative news. Now comes for me, so one slide later, the positive news, and that's amongst other PV photovoltaics. Now this graph you undoubtedly also all know. It shows the learning curve for photovoltaics on a double logarithmic scale. Prices, module prices, against cumulative shipments or installed capacity. Now, for about half a century, we've seen these costs decrease by a stunning figure of 2 orders of magnitudes. And in the field of energy, there is no similar technology that has learned in this way. Most technologies, even the incumbent dirty fossil fuel ones, they still learn, but not with these levels. Now we're actually this figure has stopped in 2015, and then the author Hegel et al. Just extrapolated this fit, and I guess that when we would reach 1 terawatt of installed capacity, which is roughly the figure that we are at now, we would be at close to $0.50 per watt peak, and that's actually more or less where we are at now. And it would take another, a couple of doublings, another order of magnitude of installation when we reach the figure of even half of that figure, so $0.25 per watt. And at that point in time, really, you could start saying that we'll have competitive photovoltaics, not just in those countries where it's happening already now, like in Mexico and the Emirates, but close to everywhere in the world. Now, our role as analysts, as researchers in this domain, is trying to understand a little bit what's happening. Why is this so phenomenal, this cost reduction figure? And there are all sorts of efforts. One of the things that we have recently been doing is trying to see whether this is perhaps thanks to the fact that photovoltaics is so modular. The individual electricity producing units are so small, completely different from what we've seen in the past with fossil-based, thermal-based power plants that are at the order of gigawatts typically per unit. Now, so what we did, we searched through the literature and also ourselves calculated learning rates, and that's summarized in this graph. The learning rate here, by the way, means a learning rate of 20%, which is the one that we have seen for photovoltaics, means a cost reduction of 20% with every doubling of installed capacity. Now that figure we collected for many different technologies across the demand sector, storage, and also the supply sector, and tried to see, so learning rates on the y-axis, to see whether there was a relation with unit size that we plotted on the horizontal axis. Now it's very difficult to properly fit, of course, this blob of dots, but nevertheless one could see that typically the very large scale plants, the traditional fossil-based power plants, they learn much with much lower values, typically between 5 or 10%. While the very small technologies, they often, not always, but often do much and much better. So we think, but there is still much more to be researched about it, that one of the clues is the unit size of photovoltaics. And that's why we think that we may need to steer towards a system in the energy transition that we're currently in, towards technologies that are much smaller and much more modular than the thing that we have seen so far. And that means giving up on important economies of scale, because it's not for nothing that these plants so far were built this big, so we would give in on that. But while being small, we can profit from the fact that we can more easily scrap older generations of technologies, replace them, and hence exploit this learning by doing phenomenon. And we think that we focused too much on the economies of scale last century, and that now is the time to focus more on this learning potential and profit from this effect that may actually be bigger than the one involved in economies of scale. Now, so we tried to test this and figure out more about it, and now we thought, for example, of developing a learning curve for microwave technology. Now microwave was discovered or so technology a century ago, entered our kitchens in the 60s or so, and now has got a huge installed capacity worldwide. So we thought of developing the learning curve for microwave ovens, and there indeed you see pretty much the same as with photovoltaics, a learning curve with a learning rate of 20%. So very similar to photovoltaics, and again, a technology which is very small. Now, so on the one hand, this confirms a little bit what we are trying to point out, which is that we should probably go small rather than big in our future energy system. On the other hand, this is a stepping stone for actually using microwave technology for other purposes than for heating our food at home. Microwave technology can be used for pyrolysis, which could be a way of involving biomass at higher levels than today in our energy system. But it could also be used, and it's actually something that's being researched in Differ and Eindhoven, for breaking up carbon dioxide, for example, thereby adding to trying to recycle carbon dioxide, and using the produced carbon monoxide to produce all sorts of hydrocarbons. Now, and there I enter one of my main topics for today, which is that of recycling CO2 and producing solar fuels, which is basically connecting to the thing that I said earlier on, which is that we should try in the second half of the century try to reach negative emissions. Until the middle of the century, we know pretty much what we need to do, which is at a massive scale increase the use of photovoltaics, along with wind energy, geothermal energy, apply CCS, in some cases even nuclear. But we don't know yet too much about how to deal with the second challenge, which is the second half of the century. And there this starts kicking in. And this is actually the rationale of why also your community, I think, should be very much focusing on the field of recycling CO2 solar fuels. Now, what is the rationale? As we all know, fossil fuels originate from biomass that has been produced through photosynthesis over millions of years. And we currently are in a very rapid way burning all these fossil fuels that have been accumulated over many millions, hundreds of millions of years, hence the problem that we are facing. Now, the initial thought was to speed this system a little bit up, because it's a cycle that takes a million years, to the level of only 1 year by using biomass instead of fossil fuels directly rather than waiting for millions of years until they have turned into coal and gas. Now that's an interesting thought, of course, but there are several buts. First of all, we would like to speed it up even further, not just a year, but typically a matter of hours or days. Secondly, as we now all know, biomass has got all sorts of deficiencies as well. It can impact, if you do it on a large scale, on our food system. It has impacts on food prices, impacts in terms of land use change, biodiversity. It's very water intensive. You need pesticides, fertilizers, etc., etc. So there are all sorts of obstacles for that cycle. And that's why ultimately we would need to reach that second half of the century goal to this right side of the figure. So we would like to bypass this natural photosynthesis and biomass cycle and turn to the one that is represented by this inner circle cycle, much shorter, but driven by renewable energy, trying to create these fuels that our economies rely upon. Now there are mainly four categories of technologies to do so. The goal is, with the help of renewables, turn CO2 and water into a whole range of different renewable fuels. Hydrogen is the starting point of it often all. But if you've got carbon monoxide, you can basically, from there onwards, produce anything else. Methanol is indicated here, but subsequently almost any hydrocarbon that you could wish. Now there are four categories to do so, as I said. First of all, by concentrating, for example, solar energy in a process that one refers to as thermo-conversion. Through thermo-conversion, you can convert these building blocks into almost anything that you want indicated in the bottom. A second category, the most commonly considered now, is through the use of electricity. Process called electro-conversion. And there, solar energy, of course, is a prime candidate, but others, like geothermal or wind power, can be used as well. Then there is the one that I just mentioned, natural photosynthesis, so the use of biomass in a process that one could call bio-conversion. There also, by the way, you can think of microorganisms that either themselves can be used as fuels or themselves produce the fuels that we are interested in. And then last but not least, artificial photosynthesis. And that's a collection of many different techniques. Things, names that you see in the literature are notions like artificial leaves, photoelectrochemical cells, photocatalytic powders. There's all sorts of options. And generically, photoconversion is the name of the process involved there. Now, our role herein is not to do the research that many people like you perform, but is try to, at an early stage, already think a little bit about the economics. And that's one of the messages that I have to do for you, is that it's beneficial for all of us, and especially for dealing with climate change, to think at an early stage already about the costs of technologies. And not only what the costs are now, that one can calculate in principle, but especially what these can become in order to upfront make a guess of whether ultimately this could lead to something that can be implemented on a large scale or not. And that's a help also. It can help in determining where one allocates very limited research funding. If really we are honest about trying to help and further mitigation of climate change, then we should take into account whether actually ultimately technologies can become meaningful or not. Now, and that's the analysis that we do. Here you see a whole range of different renewable fuels, starting with 4 different hydrogen options produced through either alkaline electrolyzers or PEM electrolyzers, salt oxide based ones, or photoelectrochemical cells. Another one indicated below, syngas, so the combination of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. but you can also think of methanol, diesel, and there are many others. Now the vertical lines in black, the dashed ones, indicate the costs of these renewable fuels, but then based in the traditional way, relying on fossil fuels. In blue, you see what our estimates are of the cost of producing these fuels, but in the clean way, in the renewable way, through the options that I just mentioned. Now you see, below here we see a logarithmic scale that these costs are really much higher than our current incumbents, our current fossil fuel-based options, sometimes even by an order of magnitude. That's basically the same as photovoltaics was only 20 years ago. Now, but we firmly believe in cost reductions through learning by doing. There are hundreds of technologies just in the field of energy that have learned that way, and if you look at other sectors in energy, you see thousands of technologies that have this pattern of cost reductions. So it's reasonable to assume that the cost components that go into producing these fuels also are subject to learning by doing. Now, so one can calculate what these costs ultimately will do under a couple of reasonable estimates for the learning rate of these components. Typically 20% is what you see in many cases. Now we did this, and that's the green shaded colors. You see that basically in a time span of 20-30 years, under either optimistic or conservative assumptions of your starting point and also of the learning rate, you start crossing these black lines. In other words, you indeed do reach competitivity for these options in a similar way as we have seen happening over the past 2-3 decades for photovoltaics. Now, I won't go too much into the details of this graph, but once you're able to produce fuels, then of course you will burn again in your cars and airplanes, by which you create a net zero CO2 system. Once you're able to do that, you can use similar technologies for producing not just these hydrocarbons, but also some other chemicals and plastics and materials in which the CO2 will store it for a much longer period of time. And there you start getting into the business of reaching these negative CO2 emissions. Now this is a cycle that we proposed, representing a very realistic situation in the middle of the century, 2050, that actually does reduce by 2 gigatons of CO2 every year the amount of our CO2 emissions. We use all these materials. We keep on emitting by a fairly large amount of 8 gigatons of CO2 per year. We also recycle, and we store with an amount of 4 gigatons of CO2 per year, this CO2 in all these materials that I just mentioned. Now you would need to add a little bit of direct air capture, referred to as DAC. Entirely giving up on fossil fuels is probably not realistic either, so there will still be some input there too. But altogether, this is a system that results in a negative, a small negative level of emissions of CO2. Now, switching gears a little bit, making these deep dives. This is what I call deep dives into single technologies. I will do this for other techniques as well. But we also look at entire energy systems. And we do this through what is called an integrated assessment model. And IAMs, as they are called, are the models that are used for the IPCC, especially the reports of Working Group 3, that are produced every 6 or 7 years, on the basis of which international negotiators come to agreements such as the one of Paris included in 2015. Now, there are many institutes around the world who've got and who run and use such integrated assessment models, and so are we. So at TNO we've got such a model called TIAM ECM, and it's essentially a model with which we can simulate and optimize energy systems on a global level so as to abide by the 2 or 1.5 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement. And these models are also suitable for analyzing all sorts of energy developments and technology diffusion, and trying to figure out what the impact of specific technology diffusions could be in order to reach these targets. Now this map represents our geographical disaggregation, what it looks like in our model. You see we can zoom in into all sorts of specific countries and regions in order to figure out what local contributions to reaching this goal could be. And having such a model means that you constantly, of course, need to update. The costs of photovoltaics need to be well represented in a model like this. So we are constantly adapting the model. And we always run scenarios. We are honest enough about the fact that we don't predict with these types of models. I think we simply cannot predict in a field that is so complex as ours, especially not along the time frames that all of us are working on, which is at least the middle, but sometimes even the end of the century. But one can run scenarios, and scenarios are reasonable projections of what the future could look like under a whole set of different assumptions. Now, once you've designed these scenarios, you need to run them, analyze them, and last but not least, interpret them in terms of policy making. And that's what my colleagues and I at TNO are doing. Now, this is an example of how we used the model in a very recent project, actually dedicated to carbon capture and storage for Europe. It's a project that right now we are finalizing, but it's to indicate to you what under a whole set of assumptions, in this case power production, could look like. So it's a scenario in Europe by, for example, the middle of the century. Now you do see here, it's the dashed orange color, a very substantial role for photovoltaics. But of course you see other options included as well. Wind power is very important, hydropower in certain countries, especially in the center, Switzerland of Europe and in Scandinavia. A considerable size for CCS, either applied to natural gas or to biomass. That combination, of course, is useful because that's good to also deliver negative emissions, so taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it underground. And also that's the grey area indicated there, nuclear energy, because there are several countries in Europe that simply go ahead with this technology, so we also try to be realistic. Now, CCS has that's my critical note of our own project that we did. CCS now has a carbon dioxide capture and storage technology that you can apply to fossil-based power plants in order to clean them up. It has been called now a promising technology to deal with the problem of climate change for as long as I'm in this field. So I've seen hundreds of articles that start literally with that statement. CCS is a promising way to deal with the problem of climate change. But until today, still, we haven't seen a single normal-sized power plant based on fossil fuels being equipped with this technology. So it may remain promising for the coming 30 years, but still not seeing deployment happening. So it may well be that this dashed yellow and the dashed biomass CCS colors may not be fulfilled by this option, and that means that we will need other options such as solar energy to cover up for that. Now, it's tempting, most of us being here in Europe or even in the Netherlands, to look at scenarios from a national or continental European perspective. But it's not always a wise thing to do, because many of the developments that we see actually take place much further away, which is the reason that we run global models such as the ECN. Of course, for photovoltaics in particular, we have seen over the past 20 years that many of the relevant developments have not been taking place close to home, but here in this case, especially in China, the cost reductions that we've seen for photovoltaics were mostly realized thanks to economies of scale realized in China. Now, we think that Africa may be one of the new Chinas to come in several respects. Why? First of all, because the African population is growing enormously. Between roughly nowish and 2050, almost a factor of 2, a doubling of the population, which is already amounting to more than 1 billion. Secondly, many countries, luckily, fortunately, grow very rapidly. That's growth rates close to what we've seen in China over the past 20 years. Up to 10% is seen in many countries in Africa. Yet at the same time, the current energy system, in especially sub-Saharan Africa, is very underdeveloped. Something like 100 gigawatts for the entire continent, basically, sub-Saharan, I mean, so not taking Northern African countries into account, which is the capacity size for a country like Africa. And actually that includes even South Africa, which is, I think, like representing 1/3 or so of that entire capacity. So currently it's very substantially underdeveloped, but in order to keep up with economic growth, one needs, of course, in Africa a very much enlarged energy system as well. That, if one does it wrongly, will leave a significant carbon footprint. But here's the good news. In many cases, especially in Africa, it proves that renewables are getting the cheapest options. So Africa could actually become the first continent where we are going to do things right from the beginning. And this includes, I think, many opportunities for renewables at large, for Africa first of all, globally, but particularly also in Europe, because thanks, for example, to all the expertise that we have in-house here. Now, we ran our models to see and try to figure out what typically the numbers are of deployment of all sorts of low carbon energy options to meet the goals of our Paris Agreement. Well, and there you see, not surprisingly, stunning figures. Left of this orange bar here, you see what has been realized in terms of capacity additions every year in various regions such as the EU, Latin America, but also Africa here itself. And here is a peek into the future, what we project with the model, what is needed in Africa in order to satisfy demands and do so in a clean way. And there you see figures of, for photovoltaics, for example, that are really much higher, easily a factor of 5, than the maximum that we've ever seen for any technology in the past, for example, in Europe. So the growth that we're going to see there is tremendous, and that's what we need to be very much aware of. Now, a few more slides, I think I can, where we turn to our compatriot Frans Timmermans, who dreamt. He dreamt when he was Executive Vice President-elect for the European Commission and being asked there, being interviewed for his then future job. And he made an interesting remark in that interview where he said that in my dream, in his dreams, we would create a partnership with Africa, especially North Africa, so the 5 Maghreb countries, where we could store a huge amount of solar energy capacity and transform that energy into hydrogen, and then next transport that hydrogen to other parts of the world, including Europe. And it became even stronger because he then later on said that if we don't incorporate a perspective on North Africa, then we will be weakened. Now, so our tasks as analysts now to try to figure out whether this statement is truthful, whether what he dreamt is actually something that is true. So should we need a partnership between the European Union and Northern Africa in order together to be better off and reach our climate goals in a cheaper way than without that partnership. Now, I think that in general that's a relevant theme because currently, of course, the main reason for the energy transition is simply climate change. But until a couple of decades ago, that was not the case. Things like energy security, energy dependencies, energy prices and volatilities, those were the main drivers of the shaping of our energy system. Interestingly, by the way, these themes are all coming back again now, unfortunately, as a result of what's happening at the eastern borders of our union. Now, in this research, we were wondering whether certain dependencies that we used to be seeing are perhaps going to be replaced by new dependencies for other materials, technologies, or energy imports. It's nice, of course, to talk in terms of partnerships, but if friendships turn sour, partnerships can turn into dependencies. Now, hence, this all the reason why we focused on trying to figure out whether Europe and Northern Africa should go into a partnership, and specifically focusing on exchanging renewable electricity and renewable hydrogen. Now, I'll just show you one graph where indeed we find in our cost optimization framework that according to the model, according to this system, it does make sense to do so. And of course the rationale is that there's much more sun in Northern Africa than there is in Northern Europe. And here you see quantities of imports of in 2050 of electricity and hydrogen into Europe that almost precisely match the exports of these energy carriers from North Africa, indeed imported into Europe. And then under, as usual, as we do, under different scenario assumptions. The efficiency scenario, for example, is the one where we let the model entirely free to find the optimal exchange, and then indeed you see these huge quantities of exchange taking place. Now a little bit back to what some of you are working on, and it's actually also the bridge to the two talks after lunch. Perovskites, of course, are a big subject of research right now for very good reasons. Our role here is to try to figure out what the cost behavior is of perovskite-based panels. So we try to determine, starting in 2 weeks from now, what the capital requirements are for perovskite-based PV panels. We would like to compare them with the capital requirements for traditional silicon-based panels. In both cases, ultimately, of course, it's not so much the capital intensity that is relevant, but the levelized cost of electricity. What's the price of electricity that you get out of it? So we will calculate that as well. And then, last but not least, try to say something about these two deeper into the future. So how competitive could these panels based on perovskites become in the future under reasonable assumptions for learning rate of the various components. We hope also to initiate actually some other piece of work which is related to, for example, the material usage for these panels. Of course, essentially all of these perovskites will rely on lead, but that has an environmental footprint, and those costs associated to that usage will need to be taken into account as well. It has economic implications, so we'll see how far we will get with that. Now, the one with last slide. I think there's no doubt that solar energy is one of the keys in global climate change mitigation, and all the recent IPCC scenarios, but also many other publications, all point towards that direction. PV and other solar energy options are needed and will play a very important role in order to reach our climate goals. We're at a global level now something like 1 terawatt of installed capacity, and I think over the next 10 to 20 years we will see the 1 terawatt just for Europe, and that's my stepping stone towards the discussion during lunchtime. Now, solar energy, that's something we should really be very conscious about, can not only play a role in the current rapid change of the electricity system, but should also play a role beyond that in many other sectors, for example, through the use of solar fuels. Now, in my recommendation to you, as originally being a natural scientist, but now being more of an economist, or whatever you want to call it, is that we should go ahead with all this experimental and also theoretical, simulation-based work in relation to PV and other solar energy options. But it's very important to always, at every stage of development, complement that work with techno-economics. It's always useful to, at a very early stage, already try to figure out already something about what ultimately peak costs could be, so as to avoid dead ends that sometimes can be foreseen in an early stage. Now, a couple of sweeping statements to end. I like always to say that if we don't correct climate change is going to correct us. So it is really one of the main challenges that we face this century. And my mentor in the US, he put it another way, John Halderan, we have to manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. And I think that's exactly the challenge that we face. And we are going to experience climate change. We do already now, and it will become much worse. We can't already escape this anymore. But we should avoid that it becomes entirely manageable. And that's the aim of all my colleagues at TNO and my group here at the university, to do precisely that. So in any case, start with reaching net zero CO2 emissions by the middle of the century to avoid the unmanageable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this amazing overview and also your optimistic thoughts, besides the pressure we are all feeling. The talk is open for discussion.
Yes, I was wondering about your economic analysis of the solar fuels. Because often people say that we use either, for the solar fuels, people often say that we use either hydrogen or water as the proton source. But I guess it makes quite a big difference, both energetically and economically, whether you use hydrogen or water as the proton source.
I really mean by hydrogen, because in our case, the starting point is always water. But you're referring to
so when you convert CO2 into hydrocarbons,
yes,
then you need either water or hydrogen gas.
Yeah.
But this hydrogen gas is something that has to be made from splitting water and has to be transported, stored, etc.
Right.
So in your analysis, what do you take as the hydrogen source for the hydrocarbons?
I mean, currently, of course, the fossil fuel industry is already heavily using hydrogen in refineries. And the starting point there is, in most cases, natural gas, in some cases oil or coal, but it's mostly natural gas, steam, methane, reforming, and then ridding or not yet the CO2 produced from that, and using the hydrogen for all its purposes. That's not what we call clean. Certainly not if the CO2 is emitted in the atmosphere, but well, not really either. If you manage most of it, it's never complete. Capture rate is typically 90% or so. But even if you manage to capture most of that and store it underground, there may be all sorts of other environmental impacts there. So our approach is always the splitting of water, and then reliant on renewable energy. Solar energy could be other options as well.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if you knew how much the decrease in cost for new technologies depends on production being moved to cheaper countries with cheaper labor and less ethical conditions.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So we have to be realistic about the fact that thanks to China's activities in this domain, we have seen these tremendous cost reductions in the past. But for the future, things are going to change in several respects. Because the country is getting richer, and the labor costs will thereby also increase. So we will see that competitive edge in China decreasing. That means that other countries, including also Europe, will play a role. Then there is labor ethics that plays a big role, and especially, and I think that could be the benefit for Europe too, actually. One is automation. We master probably as no other continent in the world, region in the world, processes related to automation, also this country, in the south of the country. The other one is that what we could make us strong is trying to create processes that are entirely clean, because we all know, that's I guess what you're referring to, that in China environmental standards are much lower than here, or even in the US. our strength could be to actually do the same job, but then in a much cleaner way, without most of all the environmental impacts along the entire cycle, the life cycle. So both mining your materials, producing your products, and actually at the back end, ridding your unused panel in a circular, in a clean way. So.
Do you think there is a kind of timeline for this, like, or is this just future kind of hopefulness?
Well, good question. Your guess is as good as mine. I wouldn't be able to make any prediction here. But things develop very fast in all these different aspects, also in China. So the benefit in China is I think quickly going to disappear. For both these reasons, so both the environmental impact ones and the fact that they won't have that labor cost advantage as much anymore as they used to have over the past 20 years. So sometimes these things can happen in a matter of years. Yeah.
I have a question about your learning curve for the cost of a PV panel.
Yeah.
I think it's already even more optimistic than what you showed, because we're already close to the 20 cents per watt peak.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if your learning curve models can predict what is the ultimate lowest costs of a solar panel, because 20 cents per watt peak, a solar panel is 300 watts, right? So it's €60 to make.
Yeah.
That's already incredibly cheap.
Yeah.
And it's not the solar cells, it's not the glass, it's the frame, and so there's a limit. It's not like Moore's law, it's just materials. So can you predict what's the lowest cost?
Yeah, so two things. What you also said is that interestingly, it's becoming now the balance of structure. All the other stuff that is becoming the most important part, which is stunning, I think. That the part that produces electricity is just becoming the smaller cost contribution. The other thing, we almost never use the word predicting. We make projections, scenarios. We know that one needs to be very careful in this domain. But we have tried to, in other cases, not yet for PV, try to see where the threshold could be, the bottom line, I should say. And on the basis of certain material requirements, you can in some cases see, well, it will probably never get lower than this or that. We have done this for a couple of technologies, and we even produced a learning rate, with a learning curve on a double logarithmic scale. It's always a straight line, but we actually came up with an alternative where even on a double logarithmic scale, you get a curve to reflect
materials costs.
And at some point you will always get that point. Yeah.
Okay.
But
I had the second question.
I mostly rephrased your question.
Yes, thank you. I had a question about this learning rate change versus system size. You showed that the PV has an advantage because it's small scale. You even suggested we should go away from the large scale fields and go to smaller scale. But I was always under the impression that the scalability as such is the important advantage. So the ability to make both small scale structures and the large scale structures, because the cheapest are still the large scale ones. But you have the ability to grow on all kinds of scales.
Right. Well, yes, so here maybe the other word would be divisibility. A fossil-based power plant, a nuclear power plant. There are now, of course, because one sees these developments in the field of PV, IDs never realized thus far to make modular nuclear reactors, and then having 10 or 100 of them together, still representing that typical 1 gigawatt, but that hasn't gone any far yet. Typically, these plants, they are hard to divide up, I think, in modules, while photovoltaic, even if you make a field of 1 gigawatt, they will still end up constituting or being made out of all these thousands of different panels that individually you can change. And you could have a section of your 1 gigawatt field. You could say, well, that's a technology of the previous generation. We could benefit now from these or that research development. Replace part of it directly to use and see whether it works in practice, etc. So that turnover is much quicker, and I think that remains the big strength for small technologies at large and for photovoltaics in particular.
question is whether you see any initiatives to use PV to generate hydrogen for export or long-term storage, or when do you expect, say, a first facility will be there?
Yeah, so I think it's going to happen. Well, at all these meetings that I attend, you hear in this country in any case, but also elsewhere, Germany, France, the enormous quantities of hydrogen that we are likely going to need soon if we are going to decarbonize, for example, industry, steel plants, etc., etc. In this country, for sure, we won't be able to produce all that hydrogen that will come from elsewhere. And well, our ministry, ESK, our Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy, is currently actually making all these deals between the Netherlands and faraway countries, as far as Uruguay and in Southern Africa, to produce locally clean hydrogen. And I think in most cases it's actually reliant on photovoltaics, but I need to check. But it's something very actively talked about. I don't know yet of similar plans also to do so in the Netherlands. But in countries where PV electricity is much cheaper than here, it's I think in the Emirates it's a similar story.
But not yet.
I don't think it's operational yet, but that may also be a matter of years. Yeah.
Right question, Albert, if you.
So you want to ask again about your scenarios now. You're very careful to say we don't make predictions, but scenarios, right? And so the question is what scenario will be reality? And that's triggered by the picture of Frans Timmermans that you showed. And that is all politics, right? Politicians that have to make plans. And we've seen, I think also the fact that nuclear power is in discussion again in the Netherlands, it's a very small number of people that have triggered a discussion when the government policies were written. So it's very random how these political processes go. And so I'm just curious if you try to make a connection, if you try to influence people in the ministries or political parties, or how does this work?
Yeah, so we are not at TNO. We're not in the business of influencing.
There's discussion about that, right? Whether you should, that could be a role of TNO to inform the government about these scenarios and help push them to make decisions.
Yeah, right. But there is this sweet point between. In principle, our task is to advise, to be as neutral as possible, and ultimately it's policymakers to make the decisions. And I think we as independent researchers shouldn't step too much in their place. That's their task. At the IPCC we get very concrete instructions about that as well. We should be, what's the framing now again? Very nice wording for that. You should be policy relevant without being policy prescriptive. That's the way they put it. And that's I think also our role at TNO. And of course there are opinions for us as well, but that depend, by the way, on the group in which you work, and even in our mostly techno-economic and policy-related group, different views on these matters. I think the best thing.
So maybe that's our role as scientists to take that job, to do the lobbying, the pushing, using your scenarios, and make sure they happen.
Yeah, well, we consider ourselves also as scientists, but then social plus natural scientists. So in that sense, we are in the same boat, but we do more applied stuff than here, obviously, where it's more fundamental. But it's
okay.
Careful answer.
Thank you very much. Good point to end here.